Hi, how's everybody doing? This is Mickey. Well, in the next few series of videos, I want to go over the masking tools of Lightroom. I haven't made a video about the basic use of masking tools in over a year, and there has been a lot of changes to masking by Lightroom, making it much more capable, and honestly, it is the secret sauce of Lightroom now. If you don't understand masking and all the capabilities, you're just not getting the most out of Lightroom that you could get. So my intention is to really go over the art of masking, because there are so many new capabilities that you can really use a combination of masking tools or add, subtract, intersect, that it is a real art now. And I would like to kind of cover that a little more by showing you some demos. To start out with, I'm going to cover the linear gradient today. And for those who aren't familiar with the linear gradient, or you just need a refresher, let's just go over that. In the Develop module of Lightroom, we want to click on the little masking icon, and you can see we have a linear gradient. You can also see there's a shortcut key for it, which is the M key. So whether you click on linear gradient or choose the M key, you will launch into the linear gradient, which gives you a little crosshair. And this is how we apply the linear gradient. By holding our mouse button down and dragging up or dragging down, we apply our gradient. Now, however far you drag, adjust the feather of the gradient. So let me just bring this down a little bit so we can see what this gradient is doing. The area of the color of the fuchsia, that's called the overlay, and that's where the effect is applied. If I make changes to exposure, you can see that area of fuchsia gets an effect applied to it depending on where it is on the photograph. So let's talk about that now. At the very bottom, I call this the 100% line or 100% pen. It's the red pen. Anything from that line down, it's going to be 100% of the effect applied. From the red dot to the square pen, that moves from 100% to 50%. From the square pen to the circle pen, it goes from 50 to 0. So as you can see, as I make my changes, we get all the effects applied to the bottom, where nothing gets applied above the line where the white pen is. Now you can change this gradient by grabbing either line, the bottom line or the top line, and dragging it further down or further up. By dragging it down, you make your gradient softer, meaning that the change is much more gradual. But by moving it up, the change is much more drastic, as you can see. All right. You could do the same thing with the upper line by dragging it, or either way, to make your feather of your gradient a little smaller or a little tighter, which makes it much more drastic change. Now, if you want to move these two lines together, say like I like this feather, but I want to make it a little wider, you can hold your Option key down, and when you do that, both lines will move in unison. So that's the way you can keep your center line. I want my center line to be right here above this wheat, but I want to make my feather a little wider so the change isn't as abrupt. Now you can also change the angle by grabbing this white pen at the very top and sliding it to the left and right, and you can see we can change the angle of the gradient. You can also hover over the center line and click and drag, and you can change the angle that way. And you can see it moves pretty fast. If you need to be more precise and you want a slower change, move way out here to the side and do the same thing. The further you are from the center line, the less movement you get as you drag back and forth or up and down. So you can see I have much more control like this. Now you can put a perfectly horizontal gradient in, and let's just get rid of this gradient real quick. Let's delete all masks, and we'll choose our linear gradient. If I hold my Shift key down, I then can drag, and it will stay perfectly horizontal. I'll just drag till I get the full gradient that I want, and release. Oop, I dragged after I released, so it did that. And that gives us a perfectly horizontal line. Now you can't hold the Shift key down and try to drag more. It's only on the initial drag. All right, so only when you're first putting the mask down can you do the horizontal kind of application. The overlay is controlled the color is controlled right here. If you want a different color, you click on this colored box and you choose the overlay color that you want. You can also change the opacity by moving this back and forth so you can see through it, or make it a little more dense so you can see exactly where you're masking. After you put a change in place, you also have an amount slider. And this amount slider changes the effect of the gradient that you just put into place. It's independent of exposure or whatever changes you make. So if you made a highlight, shadows, and a white change, this will affect all those changes equally, the amount slider. You can also hover over your center pin, hold your Option key down, and that will turn into a slider bar. And if you hold your mouse button down, you can now move the amount slider the same way you did on your control panel, except now you can do it on the screen. Just gives you a good way to get that change just exactly the way you want it. There are a couple more controls that you can use. If you want to turn the overlay off, you click the O key, turns it on. O key turns the overlay off. This way you can turn it off and on with just a click, so you don't have to worry about it bothering you while you're trying to make the changes. You can also, you'll notice that when the overlay is on, as soon as you start making exposure changes, it immediately turns it off so you can see those changes. All right, we'll turn the overlay off. If you hover over the center pin, it will bring the overlay back as long as you're over the center pin. The next thing, shortcut that we have is with this tool, sometimes it kind of gets in the way and you can't see exactly what's going on. If you hit the H key, it hides the tool. You can still make changes and see everything, but it hides the gradient tool. So once you have it in place, you might want to just hide it. The H key again brings it right back. All right, let's get into these photographs as a demonstration of the linear gradient. The linear gradient in all these may be a primary, could be a secondary, and I also stack linear gradients on top of each other to affect different portions of the photograph. So that's what we'll be doing here now. So for this first one, I'm going to use my basic panel and hit auto just to brighten it up a little bit. Then I'm going to crop it down to probably about 8 by 10. Just give us a more realistic area to work with. Straighten it up just a little bit. All right, next thing I want to do is work on the sky. So I'm going to choose a sky mask, but I'm doing that to get some color into the sky because this is late in the afternoon, the sun was setting, and it actually had a band of color right above the trees. I'm going to call it about like that. And now that I have the color in the whole sky, that's not the way it looked. It actually had some blue in it. So we're going to use a linear gradient to subtract. We're going to bring it down to about right like this. So it's subtracting the blue or the color from the top part of the blue of the sky. Now you can use your pen here to get it just to the level that you want. You can also use your amount slider to make it brighter or dimmer. I'm going to give it a little more color than usual so you can see it on the video because the colors don't come out very good. The next thing to do, we need to get the blue back in the sky. To do that, we're going to create another mask. It's a linear gradient, and we're going to bring this down, and we're going to let this blend really well with a nice feather into the color, and we're just going to give it a little blue, about like this. Maybe give it a little more white in the tone. We're going to call this mask our sunset, and this is going to be our blue sky. Right, and that way we can go back to any one of these, and like if we wanted to tone this color down a little bit, we'll take the saturation down a little bit, or we could take the amount slider down a little bit because it was just a peach color just starting to appear on the horizon of this this scene. Next, we want to work on our foreground, and to do that, we're going to grab a linear gradient. We're going to bring it up to about right here. Don't want to get into this area just yet. We're going to do something different with that. All I want to do is kind of lighten up the foreground. So we'll bring a little exposure in. And what I'm looking for is a decent exposure in this area and this area. I'm not worried about the bottom just yet. So I'm going to bring up the shadows a little bit. And now what we're going to do is straighten up the foreground by hitting subtract, linear gradient. And we're going to bring the linear gradient in like this. And we're going to make it a very wide feather. And this is where you decide, you know, you can grab right here and decide where does it look good that we, darken the foreground so we get some depth to the picture, about like this. Let's hide the mask, and then look at a before and after on this one and see what it looks like. All right, make it a little wider, maybe about like that, and bring this down. So that, to me, that's about the way I want it. Next thing I want to do is just add a little color to it, because it's kind of, I want it to match the fields a little better, about like that. All right, so next we have this wheat right here in the center, and to do that I'm going to use a brush. I'm going to make the brush about the size of this bottom part, which should be a little darker, and I'm going to click once here. I'm going to make sure I'm at 100% flow and density. I'm going to click once here, then I'm going to move my brush to the other side, hold my shift key down and click again, and that makes a straight line across. I'm going to increase the clarity a little bit and just brighten it up a little tiny bit, not a lot, maybe put a little shadow in there. I'm going to make a new brush, and I'll make this a little smaller to go across the top of this wheat. And I'm going to click once, hold my shift key down, click again. And now I'm going to increase the exposure just a little bit, add a little color, maybe add a little shadow in there, and a little white. So now the tops of that is getting lit up pretty good. All right, the next thing I want to do is, I think this is a little too golden, so I'm going to grab, there's several different ways you could do this. You could use a radio mask, you could use point color, but I want to kind of mask away some of this other area before I use point color. So I'm going to grab a linear gradient. I'm going to come way up here on this one, about like this. And then I'm going to grab and subtract another linear gradient. I'm going to keep this one kind of a narrow gradient, so that we're just hitting this area right in here. And then I can use my point color. I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to decrease the saturation just a little tiny bit, maybe brighten it up, but just decrease the saturation. I think it just looks a little too golden. Let's see if we can, about like that. And it's also affecting this. I mean, you could go in here and hit subtract the object. That will take the gradient off there. So if we look at our white on black image, and we look at our overlay, we can see that this is the area we're affecting, and we don't want that tractor in the middle of it. So, but by using the white on black, you can get a good feel of what your mask is really hitting. Gives you a little better look than the cover overlay. All right, let's turn the overlay off. So that's pretty much how I remember the scene. The only thing I might do extra in here is grab a radial gradient and throw it in about like this, and increase the exposure a little bit. Maybe bring down the dehaze a little bit, about like that, because the sun was setting over in this area. And then once I have that in place, I'm going to intersect it with a radial gradient. I'm going to drag that intersection across like this. And again, let's go to black on white to see what we're doing. Turn our overlay on. So here we can see this is the sun coming in, and this lets us know how far it's coming in. So probably about right there. If we turn the overlay off, now we can move this around. You can see how the sun is coming in a little more, about like that. So if we turn it off and on, off and on, we get a little kind of haze from the sun that's coming in, the late afternoon sun. If I turn off all the mask, we look at our before, after, and after. If you really wanted to do one other thing, I could use a radial gradient to put a vignette on, and we'll hit invert, and then we'll turn the mask back to color overlay, and let's turn the overlay off, hit our tone, bring the edges in about like this. And we'll turn up our highlights to protect them because it's starting getting just a little too dark in the corners. And there's the final one. So before, after, before, and after. Like I said, if you have all your, we didn't name all of them as we're going along, but the blue sky and the sunset were the most important to me. So if you wanted to make this a little more dull, but I added a little extra color in there so you could see it in the photograph. But there was color there in the scene itself, and it was really nice complementary color against the blue sky. All right, let's move on to the next one. This next one is a real simple one. I just call it a reflected vignette, and that's just to add more contrast and bring out the subject a little more. First thing I'm going to do is just hit auto, and then I want to crop this down. We'll use an 8x10 format. Bring it down to about right like this. And the first thing I want to do is I want to do this reflected vignette. So it's a top and bottom with really only the center across the whole scene lit up. So I'm going to grab a linear gradient and I'm going to come in about right here. And we're going to darken it just a little bit. I'm also going to add a little blue in here to the water. So you can see we're kind of making a vignette, except like I said, reflected, so on the top and the bottom. So now let's add another at the top, about like this, and bring this tone down just a little bit, add a little white to make it a little less stark. We might want to widen up our gradient just a little bit, so it's not such a big change. All right. So if we look at it now, we can see that we have a darkened sky, we have the darkened foreground. If we look at the before and after, you can see it's really adding a little depth and bringing the intention in here. You could put a radial filter in the center. I'm just going to stick with linears and do it this way. So I'm just going to come up. I'm going to bring this right to about the center. About like this, and I'm going to increase exposure just a little tiny bit. Then I'm going to subtract with a linear gradient everything that's below, because I don't want anything here lit up with the linear gradient. I just want the center. So that leaves our linear gradient at the top, linear at the bottom, and we used a linear to brighten up our subject in the center. Add a little more to the shadows. Maybe add a little saturation and maybe a little clarity. All right, let's get rid of this little bird that's hiding up here. So if we look at this before and after, again, what's called a reflected vignette. We have a darkened top, a darkened foreground, and then we just give a little light to the center using all linear gradients. All right, let's move to the next one. All right, let's look at this last picture. More farmland on the eastern shore of Maryland. And I like to use these simple pictures because it shows how we can stack these linear gradients to get the picture looking just like we want, to add depth to it. So I know it looks simple, but it's just a good way to present the example of this. To start out with, I want to use my sky mask, and I want to bring out my clouds a little bit. So I'm not so much worried about the color of the sky right now. I just want to get the clouds looking a little more realistic or a little fluffier. So I'm going to bring them out, and in doing that, of course, I'm going to wash out the sky a little bit, but I'm not really worried about that right now. I'll just add a little contrast. Now let's get rid of some of these dust spots. Here's one here, one here. And then now we'll work on the sky. So, oh, wait a minute. You see here we have a red dot underneath our mask, which means our masks are out of sync. So we open up our masking panel and we go to Update AI Masks. So we do that, it gets rid of the red dot and syncs up all our masks. All right, we're going to create a new linear gradient, and we're just going to concentrate on the sky. We just want to bring some of that blue back. Put it right there. We'll drop the exposure just a little bit. We'll add a little color back in, and that way we get a nice blue sky, but we still get some nice clouds in there too. All right. So let's concentrate on our foreground now. We're going to use a linear gradient. We're going to bring it in and take in this whole field. We're going to light it up with a little exposure. Maybe add a little clarity, a little texture, and maybe just a little golden, a little more golden. All right, and now we're going to go subtract with a linear gradient, and we're going to add some depth to the field by getting rid of some of the light in the foreground. About like this. So you can widen up your mask to see what kind of fall off you get, and that looks good about right there. Right, so we'll turn our masks off and we'll see before, after, and after. The next thing I want to do is I probably need a little light on these trees here, and we can do that with an object selection, and we'll just go along right like this. Gives us some good light, and we'll just increase the exposure just a little bit, and a little bit of shadows and a little contrast, about like that. All right, now what I want to do is I want to bring in some light that's coming across this hay bales and the little silo here. So I'm going to use again another object selection, and I'm going to select these objects. This object selection tool works really well for just about everything. So you can see it had almost a perfect selection. And we're going to increase the exposure. I'm going to increase the clarity and texture a little bit. I'm not worried about getting too hot with it because I'm going to control it with an intersect. So now that we have it lit up, we want to go to intersect with a linear gradient. And we're going to bring the linear gradient in like this. And we can go to our black and white to see exactly what we're hitting. We'll turn our overlay on, and here we can see our object. This is how the light's going to fall across it. So we could make it a little longer, because if we move it here, we get all the light hitting it at once. Here we get more of the subdued light, and that's what we're looking for. So now let's turn our overlay off, go back to color overlay, and now I like to turn the exposure way up so I can get a good read on how this is hitting it. So once I get it in just the right position, I think it's effective, I then will turn it back down to a realistic level, about like this. So if we look at our before and after, so we're getting a lot of light here, then it's pretty much falling off after it hits here. All right, so let's turn our masking off. You can look at it before, after, and after. Now if we wanted to do just a little bit more in this area, we could put in another linear gradient, say right like this, and turn that down just a little bit, because I don't like all the light that's coming in this area. I want it to be more along here like this. So I'm going to turn this down just a little bit. So if we turn down the shadows, I want it more of an angular light. So now if we look at before and after, so that last linear gradient that we put on, it's kind of like we're shaping the light. You can see where we're shaping it right here. The last thing we could probably do is go to a radial gradient and kind of bring it in like this. And increase the exposure just a little bit, because you can see it is hitting down here now right near the hay bales. And we don't want to light up the sky, so what we do is subtract the sky, and it gets rid of any of the changes we did in the sky. And then we could do an intersect the mask with a linear gradient. And again, bring it across like this. We'll go to black and white again, so we can see what it's hitting. So we're kind of hitting the tree line, some of the field, and then let's move it about like this, the hay bales. So See if we bring it down about like this. Let's see what this looks like. We'll turn this back to a cover overlay. Like I said, I like to turn it up to see what we're hitting. Don't want to turn it up too much, but that looks pretty good, about like that. Let's turn this on. Before, after, before, and after. And I see we have a little glow over this, and you would just have to find where the masking is, like right in here, and you could clean that glow up in here with a brush. Other than that, it looks pretty good. We could put a vignette on it. We'll try just a standard vignette here in the effects panel. So you can bring it in about like that. Then play with your midpoint to find exactly where you want it. Then expand your feather out so it's a little less noticeable. And maybe turn the amount down a little bit. Turn up your highlights, and that takes the dark areas out of the edges. So if we look at before, and after, just a very faint vignette. Before, after, before, and after. So now if we look at the entire before and after, so before, which looks pretty flat, exposed okay, but it's just flat. And then when we put this into play, you can see we have a lot more depth to the photograph and light in areas that we expected to see on a late afternoon sunny day. Well, I hope these demonstrations helped you. If you have any questions or you have any suggestions to make better linear gradients on your photographs, please send me a note. I'd love to hear about them. And I will talk to you all real soon.